As of Thursday, June 4th, 2020, the number one searched term on Google is the word Boogaloo. And to understand what this word means, you need not look in a dictionary, for it will tell you that Boogaloo is just simply a modern dance. But to understand why people are searching for the word Boogaloo more than any other term, you actually have to go to Urban Dictionary, and they spell it out very easily. The Boogaloo, Civil War. That's it. A couple of years ago, there was an article, I believe it was in the New York Mag, might have been the Atlantic, where they said they interviewed several global security experts. They gave a relatively high probabilities chance of a civil war happening in this country. And you can see it right here. Civil war does not only pertain to war with the government, but also to political sides. Which brings me to the actual story for today. Senator Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. Send in the troops. The nation must restore order. The military stands ready. And this sparked a very serious controversy. Many people in media were outraged that the New York Times would publish an op-ed saying send in the troops, invoke the Insurrection Act, and have the army stop the rioting. The reason they were upset? They said that it would harm black individuals, notably those who worked for the New York Times, which I find particularly strange. Are the people who work for the New York Times going out and rioting? They might be. I doubt it. But we did see that story about the two lawyers who went out and tried, I guess, throwing Molotovs and got arrested. So maybe there really are people who work for the New York Times who are engaging in civil unrest or insurrection. But I doubt it. What's strange to me in all this controversy is that Tom Cotton is talking about the widespread looting, the apolitical, the conflict, the crisis that has nothing to do with the protests. In fact, in the article, he does talk about politically motivated instances where the army has stepped in. But I think for the most part, he's talking about the rioting. Who's defending the rioting? Is that what these journalists are doing en masse, the New York Times, as they tweet that this is dangerous and they revolt against their own company? This, to me, is evidence, in my opinion, that we really are heading towards civil war. Not that I want it to happen. I certainly don't. Blessed were those days that of yesterday where we got to sit around complaining about stupid nonsense and eating pizza and ordering wings. And it was all just fun and games until things started to get serious and we were faced with a real crisis. Now, a senator wants Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act and send in the military. At the same time, we have William Barr, who says he actually has evidence that Antifa is hijacking the protests. And this very well may be. We do have some evidence kind of debunking some of the other widespread theories about bricks and what was going on with these protests where bricks were piling up. And I want to show you this. But first, I think what we need to do is take a look at what Tom Cotton wants to happen. I will, however, make sure to point out the latest expose from Project Veritas after they infiltrated Antifa and what I think may happen. Now, you may not care that New York Times journalists are revolting against their leadership, essentially, by saying they shouldn't have published this, but it really does matter because you need to understand what Tom Cotton is saying. And I'm going to read this for you. It sounds like he's saying stop riots, not protests. But the journalists are saying, no, it's bad. Almost as though they conflate the two as the same thing. In which case, I mean, it's fair to say there are many people who view the riots as justified and do not want them stopped. Where does that leave us? I guess this is why most people are searching for the words Boogaloo. Some of the other top searches that were, this was posted by, I'm not going to say, well, some people were searching for certain terms this past week about what to do in the event of martial law, what to do in the event of civil war, and what does Boogaloo mean? And here we are, number one with over 100,000 searches for today, Boogaloo. Let's read the story from the New York Times. But before we do, head over to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There are many ways you can give, but the best thing you can do is share this video. I don't have the marketing budget to compete with CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC as they riddle the internet with ads and get propped up by YouTube's algorithm. So by you sharing it, you really are the most powerful form of marketing, as it were. If you think I do a good job, you think I'm better than they are, then it's word of mouth. And I gotta be honest, if we really are headed towards a Boogaloo, and that seems to be what people are thinking, then I'm not sure any of this will matter in the long run. And you do you. You do you. If you just want to watch, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, hit the like button as well, and let's read from the New York Times. The nation must restore order. The military stands ready. Tom Cotton writes, this week, rioters have plunged many American cities into anarchy, recalling the widespread violence of the 1960s. New York suffered the worst of the riots Monday night, as Mayor Bill de Blasio stood by while Midtown Manhattan descended into lawlessness. Bands of looters roved the streets, smashing and emptying hundreds of businesses. Some even drove exotic cars. The riots were carnivals for the thrill-seeking rich, as well as other criminal elements. Outnumbered police officers, encumbered by feckless politicians, bore the brunt of the violence. In New York State, rioters ran over officers with cars on at least 3 occasions. In Las Vegas, an officer is in grave condition after being shot in the head by a rioter. In St. Louis, 4 police officers were shot as they attempted to disperse a mob, throwing bricks and dumping gasoline. In a separate incident, a 77-year-old retired police captain was shot to death as he tried to stop looters from ransacking a pawn shop. This is, quote, somebody's granddaddy, a bystander screams at the scene. Some elites have excused this orgy of violence in the spirit of radical chic, calling it an understandable response to the wrongful death of George Floyd. Those excuses are built on a revolting moral equivalence of rioters and looters to peaceful, law-abiding protesters. A majority who seek to protest peacefully shouldn't be confused with bands of miscreants. And you know what? As I love to cite it, there's a video showing peaceful protesters stopping a radical who's smashing up the street for whatever reason. They grab the man and they turn him over to the police. There are videos of peaceful protesters hugging police officers and crying. There are videos of police officers taking a knee and celebrating the protesters and even marching with them. Those are the peaceful protests we absolutely must protect, where the communities come together, where people share tears and embrace each other. But these, what we're talking about, are violent riots and looting. Now, I'm not sure the military is the right option because the National Guard is capable as well. I don't know if things are going to simmer down. They may be. So maybe this is ill-timed, to say the least. But what's shocking to me is even though Tom Cotton expressly says we are not talking about peaceful protesters here, that's what people try to draw an equivalence to. He says, the rioting has nothing to do with George Floyd, whose bereaved relatives have condemned violence. On the contrary, nihilist criminals are simply out for loot and the thrill of destruction, with cadres of left-wing radicals like Antifa infiltrating protest marches to exploit Floyd's death for their own anarchic purposes. Let me stop you right there, Mr. Cotton. They're not anarchists. They may claim to be, they may pretend to be, but they tend to be revolutionary communists. I know I hate the communist word, but that's really what they are. It's the best explanation. These rioters, if not subdued, not only will destroy the livelihoods of law-abiding citizens, but will also take more innocent lives. Many poor communities that still bear scars from past upheavals will be set back further. One thing above all else will restore order to our streets. An overwhelming show of force to disperse, detain, and ultimately deter lawbreakers. But local law enforcement in some cities desperately needs backup, while delusional politicians in other cities refuse to do what's necessary to uphold the rule of law. The pace of looting and disorder may fluctuate from night to night, but it's past time to support local law enforcement with federal authority. Some governors have mobilized the National Guard, yet others refuse. And in some cases, the rioters still outnumber the police and guard combined. In these circumstances, the Insurrection Act authorizes the president to employ the military or any other means in cases of insurrection or obstruction to the laws. The venerable law, nearly as old as our republic itself, doesn't amount to martial law or the end of democracy, as some excitable critics, ignorant of both the law and our history, have comically suggested. In fact, the federal government has a constitutional duty to the states to protect each of them from domestic violence. Throughout our history, presidents have exercised this authority on dozens of occasions to protect law-abiding citizens from disorder. Nor does it violate the Posse Comitatus Act, which constrains the military's role in law enforcement, but expressly accepts statutes such as the Insurrection Act. He goes on to make some historical references, but concludes, the American people aren't blind to injustice in our society, but they know that the most basic responsibility of government is to maintain public order and safety. In normal times, local law enforcement can uphold public order, but in rare moments, like ours today, more is needed, even if many politicians prefer to wring their hands while the country burns. The New York Times has been heavily criticized, and we will get to the criticism. But I want to talk to you about the extremism and the threat of what may come. I don't know if a military response is the appropriate response, but I can say that the factions that are feuding with each other stem from the highest levels of our government, from Democrat to Republican, from Trump to Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, who really conflict with each other and continually accuse each other of wrongdoing. But it goes all the way down to the base level, the street conflict. And this is likely why you are hearing the phrase Boogaloo. Isn't it so silly? This is how history will look back upon us. We are truly a lost generation, aren't we? They're going to say in the late 2000 or in the early 2000s in 2020, what did we see? A reference to an 80s movie became the word of choice to represent the coming civil war. Perhaps a military response could actually stop things. I don't know. I don't like that idea because I've seen what happens when countries invoke military power to stop conflict. You do not want to know what happens in these countries. Let's just say loss of life is an understatement. When the political system begins to fail, notably in Egypt, the military steps in. And then you have martial law. And I assure you, all of these people on the left, they will not be enjoying it. Well, you do have far left extremists who are exacerbating the problem, trying to make it worse. Accelerationists, as it were. These are people who want things to get worse faster and faster and faster so that our way of life, the standard American way of life, falls to the gutter. Then they will be able to use that conflict to shape the world in their image. That's what they think. They think that the only way to actually rebuild their utopia is to tear down the old world. And thus you get Antifa infiltrating these events to accelerate. Here's the story from the New York Post. William Barr claims he has evidence Antifa is hijacking George Floyd protests. The Post reports. Federal law enforcement has evidence that extremist groups such as Antifa are hijacking nationwide protests over the death of George Floyd, according to William Barr, Attorney General. Barr said he understood most protesters were peaceful demonstrators, but that his Justice Department has since found evidence that extremist agitators were hijacking protests to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. Quote, "We have evidence that Antifa and other similar extremist groups, as well as actors of a variety of different political persuasions, have been involved in instigating and participating in the violent activity," Barr said at a press conference. President Trump last week said he would designate Antifa, a shadowy far-left radical group, as a terror organization and blamed the group for inciting looting and burning businesses as protests over Floyd's death at the hands of Minnesota police have engulfed the nation in violence, looting, and civil unrest. The nation's top law enforcement official said the feds had made 51 arrests in connection with violent rioting and called on state and local leaders to work with the National Guard. Barr did not address questions over his leadership, including the decision to clear protesters outside the White House on Monday evening, which the White House said came at his direction. FBI Director Christopher Wray also singled out Antifa and other agitators, who he said, quote, "set out to sow discord and upheaval rather than join in the righteous pursuit of equality and justice. We've directed our 200 Joint Terror Task Force around the country to assist law enforcement with apprehending and charging violent agitators who are hijacking peaceful protests on a national level." Wray said the FBI had also been working hard to identify and prevent hate crimes and to investigate abuses of power and authority. Now, the one thing I really want to address before we move on to what's going on with Antifa is this story. Bricks in Frisco, Texas, left for construction, not protest. This is apparently confirmed, the Associated Press says, ahead of Monday's protests in Frisco. Social media users began circulating photos of a stack of bricks to suggest they were placed there for protesters. All of a sudden, this shows up on a path of the protest. One post with more than 1,600 shares said, "You want to tell me this is not planned and organized? How?" Well, they basically said it was part of a pre-planned construction. The protest route was planned to start, yada, yada, yada. All right, so we get the point. They say the package of the block of bricks located on the corner of Fisher Road was about a 10-minute walk from where the protesters would be marching. They were left there for a homeowners association construction project, he said. This is just one instance, but I do think it's very important to point out that in some of these instances where we've seen bricks, they've been wrong. There was a photo of a cage full of bricks. Apparently that was a barrier. This here, they're saying, was part of a homeowners association construction project. They're not all confirmed, but I will tell you this. To me, we have seen evidence that Antifa was giving out bricks, and maybe that was just some dumb kids who saw this and took after it. It's also possible a lot of these were just coincidence, happenstance, but it also does fall in line with tactics I've seen from Antifa before. Now, they've made the joke where they're like, oh, yes, I'll just call Lowe's and tell them to drop off a stack of bricks randomly. No, they pick them up and they drop them off. But we don't know where the bricks come from. That's absolutely important to say. And a lot of people believe it is a setup. Now it seems like some of these are absolutely not. But let's talk about Antifa. A lot of people have been bringing this up lately. I've seen these propaganda posts going around defending them, and it really does hit all of the great points, arguing all of these things that Antifa tries to claim. They're not really an organization. There's no leaders, that there's no funding, there's no meetings, there's no membership. All of these are 100% false. And they misrepresent what is actually happening with the idea of what Antifa is. They say Antifa just means anti-fascist. Technically true, that's where the name is derived from, but it's actually derived from antifascista action, which is associated with the Communist Party of Germany, which lost. Their statement of Antifa wasn't literally about all fascism is bad. It was about opposing the rival political party to which they lost and they would engage in conflict with. What we see now is a militant far left extremist group that operates with individual cells and membership and guiding principles. They tend to believe in very similar things. They use the same symbols. They have the same tattoos. They use the same tactics. Some of the names of these organizations are very different, but they do have branded cells with membership, as we are now definitively seeing with James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. In the latest expose from Veritas, they infiltrated NYC Antifa. And I'm not going to read what these quotes are, but let me just say, they specifically told the individual, reframe the idea of self-defense as not simply you're being acted upon by an aggressor. Now, I think it's fair to point out in this video from James O'Keefe, you're witnessing what is very likely legal speech and legal self-defense training. But it does show you that political extremists are organized in a building and undergoing training. This is why the U.S. government is reticent to label these people as actual terrorists, because they have free speech rights to express their ideas. They are legally allowed to engage in self-defense. The line is when they actually break the law. Now, what they will tell you in response to Trump and Bill Barr is they will pass around this propaganda about how they're not really a group and there's no Antifa. And I see a lot of people that actually thought I had respect for and now call into question, because they're posting these stupid jokes saying things like, oh, how do I join? Yeah. Who's the leader? Who do I call? And I'm sitting here thinking, there are leaders. I know many of their names. I know what they do. I know their plans. I know their tactics. Why? Well, I've been covering this for about a decade. I know some of these people. They personally were friends with me on Facebook, and they've gone nuts in the past several years. Some of the people I knew from Occupy Wall Street, and I can name many of them. Well, now we can see another example of, yes, there is an organization, Rose City Antifa, one of the most notorious organizations in the country. They're quite literally a branded cell with membership where if you want to join, you must contact their formal leadership and undergo a vetting process as exposed by Project Veritas. So when people say that it's an idea, not a group, please tell me why an idea has a brand name, flies the same banner as the other cells, has a leader, has funding, and literally has branded merchandise. Well, that's my favorite part. You can get your official sweater branded with the logo. This is what we can see from Project Veritas. Here's a quote. Depending on the setting, if I were to be caught or found out in a setting where I am present with them, it could escalate to violence against me. Project Veritas does not condone any violence whatsoever. It is a sad time in our nation's history, with Antifa activists hijacking Black Lives Matter protests in cities across the country, attacking the police and engaging in violence. That's according to James O'Keefe. According to one document telling people how to form their own Antifa cell, they specifically say, try and infiltrate Black Lives Matter. There's a video from Black Lives Matter activists complaining that far leftists are taking over and because of this, they're quitting. And now Bill Barr says he's got evidence. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. He said he did. It doesn't matter. There is a formal organization, not one, not apparent, but there is an ideology for which you can fly the flag. And you know, when you do, that if you have an event happening in an area where you live, you can contact your partner cells, your sister cells, and they will bolster your ranks. And no, that you can argue that when these things happen, there's no one leader telling everyone to march and leading the charge on horseback. These tactics are designed specifically to bypass federal law enforcement. I know because I've sat in the meetings during Occupy Wall Street and I've heard exactly why they do what they do. One of the first rules they taught during Occupy was not to have any identifiable formal leaders that could be targeted in public and smeared. Now, the government knows who's in charge because there always will be a hierarchy. Someone's got the money, someone controls it, someone makes decisions. Sometimes it's more than one person. Typically, it is more than one person. But publicly, there won't be a name. There won't be a leader on purpose. Because if you have a leader, the tactics used against you aren't just to arrest you, but to smear you in the press and make you look bad and turn you into something that makes it harder for you to organize. By avoiding this and claiming there is no group in the public, they make it very difficult for federal law enforcement to actually target this group. One of the most important tactics of Antifa is to make sure many people don't understand what their cell organizations do. Thus, you will see regular people posting Antifa propaganda where they proclaim they too are Antifa, even though they have nothing to do with these extremists. They don't engage in any of these riots. And it's essentially an I am Spartacus kind of idea. Instead of having people choose to stand up and say, I am Spartacus, so they can't tell who really is Spartacus, they trick people into all flying the banner. That way, when the government actually targets someone who breaks the law, what do they say? They say they're just going after people who oppose fascism. It is a trick. If you see prosecution of Antifa, it will probably be related to specific activities, transfer of funds, material support tied to an extremist ideology. There have been bottles of gasoline found around various cities. We can argue not all of the bricks were planted, and that's an important point. Fact check says some of them were just normal bricks. What about the bottles of gasoline? This is another tactic they use, and the authorities have said they have found them, Minneapolis particularly. This is a tactic. It is politically motivated. These people are engaging in extremist acts, and if they do, then they will get prosecuted. If a normal person engages in an assault, well, they'll get charged with an assault. If a person engages in an assault because they're targeting someone of a race or some kind of identity, it gets upgraded to a hate crime. I imagine this will work in much the same way. If someone engages in some kind of rioting activity, they will get charged with rioting, looting, trespass, breaking and entry, or whatever. If you add on an extremist ideology, they upgrade it to a terror charge of some sort. That's what is likely to happen moving forward. This organization is disorganized, to say the least. But at the cellular level, at the local towns, NYC, Rose City, they go by many other names. They have groups, they have leaders, they have funding, and they do engage in this behavior. Now, what will truly spark a Boogaloo? I really don't know. We've seen the chairman of the Joint Chiefs tells troops to uphold the Constitution, defying Trump, slamming him as a Nazi. Jim Mattis, former generals calling out the president. From the highest levels, we are seeing the rift and the split. And I know people will take their sides. Ranks are forming for the worst. This is not good. You will not like it. You will not be happy about it. Regular people will regret it the day it escalates to that point. You will cry in fear. And it's going to be one of the most horrific days you'll ever experience. And you can only pray it doesn't happen. And I will warn each and every one of you right now. These people who are calling for a Boogaloo, they don't really know what's to come. And they think they're playing a game the same as the Antifa types. They don't realize. They haven't actually seen this. Maybe some of them have. Because a lot of these people have traveled around the globe. I know I've seen it. And I know you will regret it the day it happens. And you will cry and beg for another chance. It won't come. Because truly the darkest days lie ahead if we can't steer clear of this. But with Hillary Clinton accusing Trump, with Trump accusing Obama, with the politicians accusing each other, with people on YouTube accusing each other, myself included, I'm a part of this game, same as anybody. It will really come down to something nasty. And you don't want to be there for it, but it's coming. I don't know what else you can expect. You know, the New York Times is being slammed by their writers. They're saying that it's threatening Black lives. And this is the final point I'll make. When the writers of the New York Times are revolting against their own leadership over something as simple as an idea, publishing an idea, a thought, then realize that these famed institutions of free speech and journalism and intelligent thought, to say the least, of real debate, they're gone. They're gone. I know why the New York Times published Send in the Troops. They did it because it is a senator of this country making that point. The New York Times doesn't agree with it. Their editorial board actually disagreed with it. In fact, the New York Times actually published something from the Taliban. And where were all of these journalists to condemn this? They did not care. Conservatives called it out. And the New York Times made the same point. We publish things from bad people. Today, the left is more concerned that they're calling out the rioters. Where does it leave us? If businesses are being destroyed by riots that have nothing to do with these protests, and a senator says shut it down, and writers for the same company revolt in support of the riots, I hope there's no Boogaloo, man. But I said it before that I think that's where we're headed, and I still think so. But I hope I'm wrong. Stick around. Next segment is coming up at 6 p.m. YouTube.com/TimCastanews. It is my other channel, and I'll see you all then.